what is autism spectrum disorder? Sometimes known as just autism, sometimes known as ASD. So this is a condition that you will find and you'll work with students in your classes either this year, next year, or you've worked with some last year. About 1 in 80 students are impacted by this. So this means that they will be in your class and they might be in the class next door. And some year levels you may have more students. I know one year level we had 5 or 6 students, and other year levels we only have 1 or 2. But across the whole school it works out about 1 in 80 students who will have autism spectrum disorder. So what does that mean? How do you get a diagnosis? So to get a diagnosis, this is usually done by the paediatrician or by the psychiatrist. Occasionally it's done by a neurologist or a geneticist, but usually the paediatrician is the one that's going to make this diagnosis. And they may have worked with the family for some time before they make this diagnosis to make sure that it's the correct diagnosis, because it is a diagnosis that once it's made, it's for life. So we will need to make sure we get it right. So sometimes teachers are frustrated because students may go to see the paediatrician says, no, there's not enough evidence. So, and it may be then that in 3 or 4 years' time that the student's needs are more obvious and therefore the diagnosis is really clear. Whereas sometimes when the paediatrician meets and they go through the diagnostic criteria, the student doesn't quite meet enough of those for them to give a diagnosis in good faith. And I'd prefer that they did wait and gave the diagnosis correctly rather than giving a diagnosis that actually then turns out not to be correct, because that's really hard then to revoke. So what has to happen for a child to get the diagnosis? So there is a book called the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and in that, which is normally known as the DSM-5, which is the most current version, came out in 2015, and that lists a whole load of different disorders that students and adults may have, and it's about this thick with little skinny pages. So it's a really thick book to have a look through, but there are a couple of pages in there that explain what a diagnosis of autism is, along with many, many other developmental disorders. So the first part of the diagnosis is to look for persistent deficits in social communication and social interactions. So if we think about the first one, persistent difficulties in social communication, they have difficulties communicating with people. They have difficulty asking another student to play. They may throw a ball at another student into trying to get them to play with them, but they can't actually say, can we play ball? They may run past another student screaming like, come with me, but they can't actually say, let's go play. That they find that really difficult. They have that difficulty with social communication. When they're older, they say things that come out of their mouth, they don't have a filter. That they just say things and then it's like, I probably shouldn't have said that. And they sometimes get into trouble for saying those things. They blurt out things in class. And then the second part of that is a social interaction. So working in a group is really hard for them. They don't know how they fit. They don't know what to say. They don't know what to do. And those skills have to be taught. So that's the first part of autism, is that difficulty with social skills. The second part is restricted repetitive behaviours, interests or activities. So this is a student who lines things up, has an absolute obsession with dinosaurs or the weather or Star Wars. They read continuously and they do nothing else. That they really get focused on something. They can go off and play computer games for hours and hours and hours and hours at a time. They don't think to eat, they don't think to sleep, they don't think to go to the bathroom or any of those sort of everyday things. I know if you work for Microsoft, they employ a lot of people who are on the autism spectrum because they have skills that they really need in that industry. But they also then employ social workers to make sure these people leave the office, that they go home, that they wash, that they sleep, that they feed themselves, because whilst they can be absolutely amazingly on their intelligence, their social skills and their living skills are not up to scratch. So they need support with those things. So those two areas are the main things that they look at when they're looking for a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. They also look at the child's expressive language skills, because sometimes the child has great language skills and sometimes the child has poor language skills, and sometimes the child's language skills are actually masked. So one of my students used to ring his dad, who was away working for long periods of time, and he would ring his dad. He'd ask the same 5 questions every phone call. Now, to an outsider who only listened to one, they were great questions. How was your day, Dad? But if you listen to him time after time, you realise it's the same questions every phone call. He has nothing else to ask. He doesn't know any other stock phrases to use. Some students refer to echolalia, where they just repeat sentences from movies or that they've heard from other people. So I had a student who could recite for me the whole of the Little Mermaid movie but couldn't make a sentence for me to say, what did you have for lunch? He found that really hard, but he could use other people's sentences. I worked with another student who used to say, it's time to move on, which was obviously his teacher's regular phrase when we got to end of activity, it's time to move on. So often students who have autism need quite a few adjustments in the classroom. They may not need support for their academic skills, they may, but they often don't, but they do need support around the environmental features within a classroom. So in my blog post I've written six different strategies that you can use. There are books and books and books about autism. There are books, there are websites, there is lots of information, but I've tried to condense it into 5 and everything will fit under those 5. So number 1 is read the room. If the child is standing in the corner screaming, leave me alone, read the room. What do they want you to do? They want you to stay out of their space for the moment. They are trying to pull it together, and the more you interact with them, the harder it becomes for them. If they're sitting in the corner rocking and they're very anxious and they're crying, then you need to intervene with that in mind. If they come into the classroom and they're very, very anxious, then you need to work out what's going on so you can relieve that anxiety. So read the room. Watch what the child is doing. Listen to what the child is actually saying. And really listen to what they're saying. What does that actually mean for that child? And get to know that child. You'll start to be able to read, okay, that child's really anxious. One of my current students, as a much younger child, came into school very anxious one morning, and his teacher came to me and said, what's going on today? And I said, are you doing assembly this afternoon? And she's like, yeah, and he's promised his mum that he'll stand up and speak. I said, well, there's your answer. That's what he's worried about, because he doesn't think he can do it. And we had a chat with the child and we said, is this what you're worried about? Yes. And we said, well, okay, so if you want to this afternoon, that would be great. But if you don't, we'll speak to mum and say that you really, really wanted to, but it was too hard today. And that took the pressure off, and then the child's behaviour dropped down again. Behaviour is always a communication. If they're behaving strangely, they're doing something unusual, they're doing something that's quite difficult, that you can see they're frustrated, that's your message as an adult that there is something amiss, and you need to be their GPS and to guide them into how they can help themselves resolve the situation, or how you can resolve the situation with them. The next one is to listen to parents. Parents have a lot of time with their children. They've known their children a really long time, much more than you have, and you've had him in your class for weeks. So get to know that child's parents. Get to speak to them on a regular basis, whether that be face-to-face or phone calls or through emails, whatever works. But often students with autism come to school and they can hold it together and be beautiful and well-behaved and work their absolute socks off for you at school, and then they go home and the whole thing unravels. And that's really common. But we don't see it as teachers, and often teachers don't believe it and say, no, that can't possibly happen. He's so beautiful at school, she's lovely at school. And then they lose it at home because they feel safe at home. They can let it unravel. They know they can scream and shout at mum and they're not going to get into trouble. Whereas they can't do that at school because of the effect of that on their peers and their teachers around them. So that's really, really important to think about. And then if that is happening, what can you do in school to help? What activities can you do? What can you take out of their day that keeps their stress levels lower so that it doesn't all tumble out when they get home? The third one is routines, routines, routines. We all like routines. We all hate it if things change unexpectedly and we weren't prepared for that. That's really hard. And for students with autism, they really, really respond to routines, things like visual schedules, that you do the same thing every day, you line up in the same spot outside the classroom every day, maybe they put their bag in the same spot every day. Makes them feel that they have control. Because for somebody with autism, often they feel like they don't have a lot of control. So those things really help. And if things have to be changed, PE gets cancelled, then if you can warn them in advance, that can prevent a meltdown. I've seen huge meltdowns where the child's gone down to PE only to be told it's been cancelled, the teacher's sick, and they've been sent back to class, and they just can't cope with that unexpected change. That's really, really difficult for them. So routines, routines, routines. And they'll have routines that they do themselves to help themselves stay calm. If you've ever watched Rafa Nadal play tennis, you'll see he has a routine before he serves. And he pushes his hair back and he adjusts the ball so many times and he does the hair on the other side, and he has to do those things. He wipes his face. He has that little routine that helps him to stay focused and calm, ready to serve and win matches. So routine's really important. Next one is to manage their sensory overwhelm. Many students with autism have difficulties with sensory issues. It may be too smelly, and that can be lunchtimes when there's just all these different food smells around. It can be using the bathroom can be a real issue because of smells. Noise can be a problem. Using the bathroom because of noise can be a problem, so they may need to use the bathroom at other times. So managing all those senses, things that are really loud and busy, they can find really difficult because they don't have any control over what's going on. If they're making the noise, that's different, because they're in control of that noise. They can turn it off when they've had enough. But if they're going to big assemblies, big concerts, big sporting events, sometimes that can be really overwhelming. And then you need to think about what strategies you can put in place to support them. So also students often have a team of specialists behind the scene working to support them. So it's maybe an OT, a speech pathologist, a psychologist, and a whole row of other people. They're a wealth of information, and you can talk to them and say, I'm having a difficulty with this, and often they will come back because they want this child to succeed at school. They will have things that they can suggest that you do in class. And if they suggest something that's totally unrealistic for you to do in your classroom, tell them in a nice way. How could I make that ask them, how can I make that happen in my classroom? Because you've got 30 kids, they're only thinking about one. So you may need to sort of negotiate and find a balance between what you can manage in a classroom and what you can't. Because when you're making those environmental adjustments, sometimes they can be a bit tricky to organise. And then the last one is to try out different strategies. So the OT may suggest one thing to try. You may think, oh, that works really well, and then it wears off, and then you need to try a different strategy. So the strategies you may be given may work for a week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, a month, 6 years. It just depends on the child, and you have to be flexible. Now, students with autism find it really difficult sometimes to be flexible and to allow things to change. But as adults and teachers, we need to be the flexible one to go, hey, well, that's not working. So we're not going to continue to do that because that's just pointless. As Einstein said, to keep doing something that's not working, well, that's just insanity. So if it's not working, look for something else. There are lots and lots of places you can reach out to. Here in Queensland, we can reach out to Autism Queensland. They have a helpline. You can ring and say, I'm having difficulties with this, what can you suggest? Often they will suggest 3 or 4 things you've tried. They may suggest 2 or 3 things you haven't tried yet. Or they might remind you of something that you tried ages ago that you haven't tried for a while. So reach out and ask for help. So I hope that helps understanding what autism is and how you can support your students in your class by looking and watching what's going on, talking to people and getting advice.